What's going on, everybody? C4 here. Welcome back to the channel. And if you paid attention to the Madden 21 social medias, we didn't get anything for franchise mode, but last week they spent every single day showcasing these cartoony comic book kind of X Factors, these little cards and these little weird things going on because, it's X Factor week. And, not to open up a debate about X Factors, because we actually talked about that in a video before, but what I want to open up today is I want to look at players that might have been slighted to get X Factor abilities. Maybe some guys that are undeserving, but I have 10 players, the top 10 players, because of course, every video you kind of want to format it as a top 10. The top 10 players that got robbed. Put an asterisk. There's a couple players in this that I definitely think got robbed, but not all of them. But to make it a 10 list, a lot of them, there's an argument that they should have been an opening day X Factor in Madden 21. Now, I do know for a fact that Madden likes to have a nice round number. Like last year, they had 50 X Factors at launch, and they like to keep it within that bubble. And if they take someone out, they put someone in, but they don't really like to go above that number. They pretty much maintained and held firm on that until a little bit later in the Madden cycle, when clearly there was breakout players that you needed to give them an X Factor ability. So for this video, I don't really have the argument of like 10 guys that should get removed from the X Factor list, to put in the guys that I'm going to make the argument that should have been X Factors. There are four players that I think I would not have given an X Factor. But this is not necessarily the video, because I know obviously, and you're going to take it as a negative, that I don't think Adam Thielen should have got an X Factor to kick off Madden 20. Adam Thielen played in 10 games last year, 30 catches, 420 yards, 6 touchdowns. I was an Adam Thielen fantasy owner. I watched the games he was playing. I don't know. He just, maybe he was just battling through an injury. I don't think he should have just been a superstar guy. And then if he could get right back into things and can reestablish himself as the wide receiver one there in Minnesota, especially with no more Stephon Diggs, then hey, week 2, week 3 roster update, get Thielen back up to an X Factor. I just don't necessarily, I think he's very much on the bubble of a guy that should have got an X Factor ability. And I have argument that of a wide receiver that when we get to that list, that at least, you compare them, I probably think that there's a more deserving wide receiver that should have an X Factor start off than Adam Thielen. And I'm also going to put Amari Cooper in that bubble. Amari Cooper had 79 catches, roughly around 1,200 yards and 8 touchdowns. Solid year. Not necessarily saying he doesn't deserve to be an X Factor, but looking at all the guys that got them, I think there's another argument of another wide receiver that should have got an X Factor ability over Amari Cooper. Plus the fact Amari Cooper does not show up on road games, that's something else you definitely should be able to consider. I have 2 players on the defensive side of the ball that I don't think I would have given an X Factor ability. And one of them is Derwin James. Derwin James only played in 5 games last year. He needs, there's no rhyme or reason why. I do feel like he's overhyped. I think he's an awesome player. He's a very exciting player. I don't dislike Derwin James. I like watching him play. I do dislike him a little bit from the Raiders franchise, where he just made me fumble 4 times a game. But I would make the argument that let's just start him at superstar, and then let's see what a healthy Derwin James, and much like Adam Thielen, for example, if he hits the ground running quickly, hey, roster update week 1, week 2, week 3. If he shows us that he's still the exact same Derwin James and he can stay healthy, by all means, bump him back up into that X Factor tier. But to start with an X Factor, I would argue that for Derwin James, that's a little overhyped for me. I think he could have done well by having a superstar, and you could swap him out for another player that we're just about to talk to in just a second. And the last player that I don't think should have had a superstar ability is Jair Alexander. Could not be more upset when Philly was unable to draft him. He was the corner I wanted. I loved him when he was coming out of college out of Louisville. Thought he was literally getting overshone by Lamar Jackson. I was like, literally, there's almost a Lamar Jackson level prospect on the defensive side of the ball at Louisville. And then it really took him till after the combine and all that stuff that Jair Alexander first round hype took off. I do like him, but last year 58 tackles, 2 picks, 17 pass breakups. Not bad. Definitely a good corner. Is he elite? Is he lockdown? I mean, he had a 72 PFF score for whatever that's worth, but I like to look at that as like, okay, didn't watch a lot of Green Bay Packer games, but I mean, maybe he has like a 90 PFF and he was just shutting guys down left, right, center. 72 is like average, slightly above average. So I would also make the argument for someone like Jair Alexander, who's, he's old. He's not old, sorry. He's more than enough time to develop up into an X Factor. I don't know if I would give him an X Factor right out the gate. So, with that being said, I'm going to move into a nice little list, which I call the players that should have been deserving of an X Factor. I got 10 players. I can only find 4 that I would swap out, but I think we should make an argument that these 10 guys very well should have been starting day X Factors in Madden 21. Alright, so we'll just be using Madden 20 right now to highlight the 10 players I think could have very well been an X Factor to kick off Madden 21. And we'll start with Deshaun Watson at quarterback. This is just more so what I've seen on social media. I think I would make the argument that if you look at the quarterbacks that did get X Factors, Tom Brady, Drew Brees, Patrick Mahomes, Aaron Rodgers, Lamar Jackson, and Russell Wilson, I don't think you could really take any of those guys out for Deshaun Watson, but I do think Deshaun Watson could have been an X Factor, even though I do think personally, and there could be some bias, that Deshaun Watson, you got Carson Wentz. You could look at, probably maybe Matt Ryan still, Matt Stafford, and you obviously got Dak down there. That they're in that tier. I think Deshaun Watson's still not necessarily out of that tier to be put up into an X Factor, but it's valid. I mean, last year 3,800 passing yards, 26 touchdowns, 12 picks, 400 rushing yards, 7 rushing touchdowns. So he went well over 30 total tutties. He's a game changer. It's one of those things that they when EA and the devs, stuff like that, talk about X Factors, these are guys that can take over games. And when Deshaun Watson's on one, he could single-handedly take over a game and win it for the Houston Texans. So I definitely think there's a legitimate argument for Deshaun Watson being a day one X Factor for Madden 21. But I also kind of think, just from where I'm looking, I don't necessarily would remove any of the other quarterbacks. Push comes to shove, I think Madden generally got the X Factors right. Even though Brady and Breeze have been dropping off a little bit, you still can't not give them, especially when some of the X Factor abilities are, basically designed for Tom Brady and Drew Brees. What they're really good at, it'd be really weird for them not having those abilities, but definitely for Deshaun Watson, he could be in that conversation. I couldn't figure of any running backs. I think they did a great job on the X Factor running backs. So we're going to be looking at the wide receivers, and we're going to start with Kenny Golladay, who had 65 catches, almost 1,200 yards, and 11 touchdowns last year. And that was with how many games did he not have Matt Stafford? It was like mini Megatron all over again. Remember Calvin Johnson? There was just absolute garbage at quarterback for the Detroit Lions during some of Megatron's prime seasons. Didn't matter. He was quarterback proof. We saw a little bit of that out of Kenny Golladay. Then they have like David Blau and pretty much everyone in between slinging that rock under center, and Golladay was consistent on a week-in, week-out basis. So I think given what Golladay did with the level of quarterback play, I would have him over both Amari Cooper and Adam Thielen for an X Factor ability. Now, he did get Superstar, which is not bad, but I definitely think Kenny Golladay is our first true candidate of a guy that got robbed of an X Factor ability to kick off Madden 21. Staying with the wide receivers here, how do you not give Chris Godwin? Chris Godwin was sensational. I guess you could argue that the offense was pass happy, but he had 86 catches, 1,300 yards, and 9 touchdowns. I would have had Chris Godwin over both Amari Cooper and Mr. Adam Thielen. So, like I said, I don't have 10 guys that I would necessarily swap out from the current Madden 21 X Factor list for these guys that I'm going to talk about that got robbed. But I think for sure in wide receiver, you should have had Chris Godwin and Kenny Golladay in over Adam Thielen and Amari Cooper. And I'll keep swinging on that one. I think that absolutely should have happened. And even more so, because of how the Bucs offense kind of was, they're pretty much a glorified air raid. I think so far, easily the biggest miss is Kenny Golladay. Kenny Golladay got absolutely robbed. Finishing up on the offensive side of the ball, it's the only little bias you might have. I think there could be an argument that Zach Ertz should have opened up with an X Factor. There's only 2 tight ends that have X Factors. I'm kind of also a little bit surprised they didn't give Gronk one out the gate. But there's only 2 X Factors at the tight end spot in Madden 21 at launch. You have George Kittle and you have Travis Kelce. By all means, definitely deserve to be one. They are the top tight ends. But the third tight end, Zach Ertz, didn't drop off. Even though it doesn't seem like Zach Ertz he had 88 catches, 900 yards, and 6 touchdowns. The only other tight end that had better numbers, I think, was Darren Waller. And then you can make the argument Darren Waller, maybe the little bit of like a 1-year bust. Let's see what he can do. Zach Ertz has been doing it for like 2-3 years now. His reputation as really the 3rd best tight end. I mean, with Gronk coming back, who knows? But I think Zach Ertz definitely could have had a shout at being a superstar X Factor. I don't know if I personally would have put him in. The conversation's there, which is what we're having for some of these players. Not everyone's going to be so far a Kenny Golladay, of a guy that I think clearly got robbed. But I definitely think the argument could be made that you should have more than 2 tight ends be X Factors. And if you were going to have a third one, I think Zach Ertz was the most deserving name. Now let's take a look at some players on the defensive side of the ball. And we're going to start with Shaq Barrett, the edge rusher from the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. 58 tackles, 19.5 sacks, 19 TFLs, 6 forced fumbles, and 1 interception. If you're going to have an overpowered ability like Avalanche in the game for guys that force the fumbles, You're giving it to Jamal Adams, who had what, like one forced fumble last year, one or two forced fumbles last year. You gave it to Bobby Wagner, who same thing, one or two forced fumbles last year. For someone like Shaq Barrett, who was right at the tops of the leagues with 6. And again, it comes back to the argument that, well, I just kind of said at the tight end spot, Darren Waller, 1 year wonder. Maybe you don't give him an X factor over someone like, say, Zach Ertz, that has really, really good production, elite production, and has done it for multiple years. But I think there's an aspect to Madden, and you can think about it when I was a kid, man. There's always a handful of guys that are just really good for 1 year Madden because they had, obviously a 1 year wonder type season. And I think, like, give that to Shaq Barrett. He probably will never have a year like he had in 2019. I don't think Shaq Barrett, maybe he will. Maybe he's just a late bloomer. But I don't think he'll ever have almost 20 sacks and 20 TFLs in a single year. So make Shaq Barrett super overpowered in Madden 21. So this could be like the Shaq Barrett year, where like now he can be like go back into mediocrity, but he'll have that one season. He can hang his hat on, like everyone will be able to think back. Well, actually, probably not a lot of people are going to really think back on Madden 21. I don't think it's going to be a memorable Madden game, unfortunately. But if you did, you'd be like, man, remember Shaq Barrett was super overpowered way back in Madden 21? That was fun. He used to get a bunch of sacks because everyone's playing Tampa because Brady and Gronk. But Shaq Barrett really stole the show. And I mean, in real life, he never quite amounted to anything. He peaked after that moment. But hey, we remember Shaq Barrett in Madden 21. And unfortunately, they did not give him the X factor. They definitely sided on, caution and didn't want to just go for a guy that clearly had a 1 year. But I feel like, why not? Have fun. X factor abilities are kind of stupid anyway when you think about it. So why not have fun with it and reward a guy that had an amazing once-in-a-lifetime type season in Shaq Barrett. So much like Kenny Golladay, I think Shaq Barrett was a very much robbed player of getting an X factor ability in Madden 21 at launch. Next up is the Maniac, Darius Leonard. Huge fan of my YouTube channel, and I'm a huge fan of himself. He has been one of the most productive box score linebackers in the National Football League. Only, 13 games last season, 121 tackles, 7 TFLs, 5 sacks, 5 picks, 7 pass breakups. Sure, I will be the first one to admit, I love Darius Leonard. I think he's one of the best linebackers in the game. You could definitely say that, his box score stats might not be 100% reflective of like his actual talent. Linebacker stats can get inflated, but there's just all pros, second team, like he's always in the all pro conversation since he's been in this league. And I think not necessarily would I swap out any of the linebackers that got an ability here, because in terms of true traditional linebacker, what do we got? Really, isn't it just, what do you call it? Isn't it just Bobby Wagner? That's it. Look at my list here. I think he's straight up the only actual linebacker, because really it was him and Luke Kuechly. So it's kind of like the tight ends. You only gave 2 tight end X factor ability, and I guess if you're going from the side of like you want it to feel exclusive, sure, but it still just feels kind of weird that, like, especially for linebacker, there's only one. You can only find one linebacker in Bobby Wagner. I would argue that Darius Leonard should have also been a superstar back. He's not in the tier of like he got absolutely robbed of the ability, but the argument could be made that the Maniac should have been an X Factor player. Now, a edge rusher, because we have to talk about linebackers and because they don't have the edge position, I think Zadarius Smith had a sensational year for his first year in Green Bay after coming over from the Baltimore Ravens. 55 tackles, 13.5 sacks, 17 TFLs. Don't think he was robbed, but again, another one of these players, I think he should be in the argument for a superstar X Factor. And I personally don't think you're going to find too many Packer fans in particular that would have said if you had to pick between Jair Alexander, who I had as a player that I thought was slightly undeserving, or Zadarius Smith. If you had to give one X Factor ability to either Alexander or Smith, I think most Packer fans would have given it to Zadarius Smith based off of last season. So I think there's a shout there that he should have been another X Factor candidate. This one might be a little off base, but at number 8, I have Marcus Peters of the Baltimore Ravens. I think Marcus Peters, it just kind of almost comes into specific abilities. I just think he's a ball hawk. He might be the best ball hawk in the National Football League. He might give up some plays. He's a little boomer bust at that corner, but I mean, he's an X factor. If Marcus Peters is on point, he will absolutely ruin a game. And I think that should put him as definitely a bubble candidate for an X factor ability here in Madden 21. He had 53 tackles, 5 interceptions, 14 pass breakups, 3 picks, or total touchdowns. I think he had a fumble return, but 2 pick sixes. I definitely think Marcus Peters should be in that conversation. I'm a big Marcus Peters fan. I'm really a Marcus Peters homer. And I was so upset when I saw what it cost Baltimore to get Marcus Peters from the Rams, knowing that Philadelphia is an absolute crap show at corner. Hopefully not anymore with Darius Slay and Nickel Roby-Coleman, so on and so forth. But I definitely think Marcus Peters, when you're looking at the corners, probably could have got his name onto that list. And we're gonna finish with the safeties. And we'll start with Minkah Fitzpatrick, who was absolutely sensational. Production to a T. Since he got traded from the Miami Dolphins to the Pittsburgh Steelers last season. Minkah, 69 tackles, 5 interceptions, 9 pass breakups, 2 total touchdowns. I think, bubble. I don't think it's a robbery that he's not an X Factor, but he's much like, Marcus Peters, Zadarius Smith, Zach Ertz, Deshaun Watson, bubble candidates. Guys that definitely there is an argument to be had that they could be an X Factor playmaker. I think when you're looking at safeties now, the argument could be, I already said you should swap out Derwin James. I probably would have had Minkah Fitzpatrick over Derwin James for an X Factor. But I do think the number one guy that got robbed, I think it's Kevin Byard. Kevin Byard has a reputation. He has 17 interceptions over the past 3 years. He absolutely should have some sort of ability. He is the pinnacle. I know he's underrated. No, Tennessee's boring, and really no one, let's be honest, no one gives a shit about the Titans. They are very boring. I don't even say they're boring, because that might be unfair. I don't watch a lot of Titans. But you know what I'm saying. They're not a big market. They're not a team that gets talked up a lot. Even really after their playoff run. Their immaculate playoff run. Knocking upsets after upsets. Still no one really cared about the Titans. It is what it is. But Kevin Byard is amazing. Last season, he had 84 tackles, 5 picks, 9 pass breakups, and he's been doing it for 3 straight years. I absolutely 100% would have Kevin Byard as a X Factor over Derwin James. Point blank period. And I think if we end this video, because we gave 10 names, we talked about some bubble guys, I think the guys that truly got robbed of abilities, I think Kevin Byard, Shaq Barrett, and Kenny Galladay. Those are my big 3. Those, I would 100%, I'd have Galladay in over Thielen. I'd have Shaq Barrett in over Jair Alexander, I guess, to swap out on the defensive side of the ball. And then I would put Kevin Byard in over Mr. Derwin James. But that's just how I feel. What do you guys think in the comment section? But what players got robbed of getting a Madden 21 X Factor? Do you agree with my list of guys that shouldn't have? Do you think Thielen, Amari Cooper, Derwin James, Jair Alexander shouldn't have got one? As you notice, I think out of all those names, Amari Cooper is probably the most deserving. But it just pains me to say as an Eagle fan. But that's just kind of where I'm at. Let me know what you guys think about it in the comment section below. That does it for me here today. As always, if you're first time stopping by, don't be afraid to hit that subscribe button. Smash the like button if you enjoyed. Until next time, it's C4 saying peace out.